Excellent. So welcome everybody. Thank you very much for coming. A special welcome, of course, to our current Learning for Action Fellows, but also to other members of the Terra community, and of course, the members of the public as well who are welcome to this session. If you do have any questions throughout the talk, please write them in the chat panel on Zoom, and we'll come to those in the second half of the session. Otherwise we'll get straight on with it. So it's a real pleasure, and I'm really excited to introduce our guest speaker today, which is Professor Heike Schroeder. Thank you for being here, Heike. Heike is a professor of environmental governance at the School of International Development at the University of East Anglia. Her work covers a huge range of areas, including global environmental politics, forest governance, international climate negotiations, Indigenous peoples and knowledge and sustainable development, and a number of other areas as well. Heike is also a member of the Tyndall Center for Climate Change Research and also a lead faculty member of the Earth System Governance Project. So thanks again, Heike, for being here, and over to you to tell us all about the UN Climate Conference.
Great, thank you, Liam. Thanks for having me. All right, so I'll just get my slides up. Oops. Okay, so the topic that I was given is to understand the 2021 United Nations Climate Change Conference, so COP26, which, as you all I'm sure know, is going to take place in November, so in just over a month, in Glasgow in the UK. So what I want to do is I want to spend a bit of time looking back so that you all get a sense for the long process. Actually, it's been a 30-year evolution of the UNFCCC process. And I'm going to look at them through three distinct phases. So I have kind of come up with this distinction of these three phases, and also briefly look at where we're at with global emissions. So the first phase, let's say, is from 1992 to 2005. So it all started after a fairly brief kind of 18-month negotiating process until 1992, where the UNFCCC was adopted just in time for the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. And it then entered into force only 2 years later, 1994. And then 1 year after that, we had the first COP, and that took place in Berlin, and they adopted the Berlin Mandate. So that was kind of the way in which the process started. Then the next milestone I'll highlight is the 1997 Kyoto Protocol that was adopted then. But then there was still a whole 3+ years, 4 years in total, until the unfinished business, kind of the outstanding issues, were finalized and negotiated. And only with the 2001 Marrakesh Accord was the Kyoto Protocol finally finalized and ready for ratification. And quite a majority of countries only then started ratifying the Kyoto Protocol, and then it came and entered into force in 2005. So in terms of the characteristics of this first phase, we can say that it kind of followed the convention protocol approach, which means that there was a framework set up first, the 1992 UNFCCC, which outlined the institutions, the reporting requirements, the subcommittees, the subgroups. So basically the way in which the process was to unfold. It did not have any specific targets just yet, only a non-binding aim to stabilize emissions. Only then, a few years later, with the Kyoto Protocol, did targets and timetables get introduced for developing countries. So there was a specific focus on mitigation in those years. The UNFCCC Article 2, which is very important, objective says to avoid dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. So it's quite a vague, broad objective, And it was formulated in this way because at the time, perhaps there was not yet an agreement as to what that would mean. So then in this first phase, it would just be developed countries that would take the lead in mitigating climate change because they have the historic responsibility to address the emissions that were already in the atmosphere. So we can say that this first kind of attempt at governing global climate change emissions was a top-down architecture with legally binding commitments. Here's a picture just showing the Bonn venue of the conference. This was maybe a picture taken in, I think it might have been 2017, maybe a bit earlier. So the old Bundestag is now the venue for the UNFCCC negotiations when they take place in Bonn. So then the second phase. So as I've mentioned, the Kyoto Protocol was adopted finally in 2005, but unfortunately, actually without the US on board. So the US withdrew from the Kyoto Protocol in 2001. And that kind of brought up an issue in that countries were not convinced that it was worth continuing with the Kyoto Protocol second commitment period negotiations without the biggest emitter at the time, the US on board. So therefore, there was another negotiating track that was started that was referred to as long-term cooperative action. And it was so going to more kind of look at longer-term global emissions. So not just developed countries, but broadly everybody would be on board and everybody would be able or invited to make a contribution in a way. So these two parallel tracks then were taking place at the same time. By 2007, we have a Bali roadmap agreed that would determine the end of this negotiating round to be in 2009. But then we know that the 2009 Copenhagen conference, which by then was COP15, ended in failure because countries were not able to formally adopt and agree to the Copenhagen Accords, which was just a very short document in the end, because of a lot of different issues and hiccups to do with leadership, to differing positions on specific topics, etc. So it was not formally adopted. However, what's really interesting is that the gist of the text of the new elements of the Copenhagen Accord were repeated again 1 year later in the Cancun agreements, and also then became the kind of cornerstones of the Paris Agreement that was finally adopted in 2015. So the characteristics, in a way, of this second phase is that all of a sudden there were a whole range more negotiating tracks happening side by side, and also ever increasing negotiating themes. So whereas in the beginning, there was really only a focus on mitigation, now there were a whole range of new topics that had been introduced in those years between 2005 and then, that would also include a mechanism to address deforestation, referred to as REDD+, a realization that adaptation really needed to be addressed internationally as well, much more emphasis on the need of finance, and a whole range of other subtopics as well. And in addition, the climate problem had become so much more prevalent, and a lot more organizations were interested in participating, so that the COPs became so much bigger. So whilst the earlier years attracted some hundreds of participants, now we are in the tens of thousands. And the Kyoto Protocol the Copenhagen Accords already demonstrates a move toward voluntary commitments that then turned into contributions by 2000, I think maybe 12 or 13, by COP12 or 13, and then by the Paris Agreement in 2015, the acronym had become the NDCs. So we're now looking at voluntary, nationally determined contributions that are therefore bottom up, because every country can decide by themselves what contributions they are willing to make. And at the same time, we have mandatory reporting requirements. So countries are required to submit an NDC, but what the content of their NDC is up to them, is voluntary. So the Article 2 again of the Paris Agreement, the objective of the Paris Agreement is now threefold. So rather than the initial UNFCCC objective of keeping greenhouse gas emissions at a stable limit, and below a stable limit. Now we have mitigation, and here the agreement is, or the aim is, to keep the rise in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees, above pre-industrial levels, and ideally to 1.5 degrees. On adaptation, the aim is to strengthen the ability to adapt to climate change and build resilience. And on finance, it is to align all finance flows with a pathway toward low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. So again, a few pictures of COP events. So here you see a smaller number of people. So alongside the kind of bigger formal negotiations, you have a lot of side events. So organizations, from a number of different sectors present their activities, their results, their insights, etc. So then we come to the third phase in this process, maybe from 2016. So after the Paris Agreement was successfully adopted, there were still a few issues that needed to be resolved. So the Paris rulebook negotiations continue to date. Then we have the idea that the NDCs, of course, that were initially submitted either just before the Paris Agreement or after, would then be updated every 5 years. So initially we were going to have updates of all countries by 2020, but because of the pandemic, that's kind of slipped a little bit. And so we have a good number of NDCs resubmitted in 2021. And then there would be another round of updates every 5 years. In addition, there will be global stock takes. So they would happen in between, kind of halfway through NDC submission years, in order to take stock in terms of how far we have come and what is still needed to address the problem. There's also been a lot of raising ambition, initiatives, alliances, net zero 50. So the consensus, the discourse is moving toward achieving net zero by 2050. And of course, we've got the next COP in Glasgow to look forward to. In terms of characteristics for this phase, now that the negotiations on the whole, kind of to a large part, have been concluded, it's now all about implementation, to actually implement these NDCs and the increased ambition as well in these NDCs. There is on the whole maybe a much broader societal uptake of the climate emergency framing worldwide. There is some shift in rhetorics, especially in the US, but also in China. But of course, there is still no peaking in global emissions. And also, therefore, the emission gap is still increasing. So here's a graph showing you the emissions gap. This is a graph that was initially put out by UNEP around the Copenhagen conference. And it shows the way in which historic emissions have been increasingly exponentially, and that the business as usual scenario would have this continue up to 2050. But what we need to do in order to stay on a path that would keep us below 2 degrees Celsius is that we have to really stop. We have to really get to our peak emissions year and then drastically reduce. The longer we wait with turning that ship around, the steeper the reduction curve would become. So this graph kind of just abstractly shows you the decrease when it comes to 2 degrees. If we wanted to stay within 1.5 degrees, then of course the reduction curve would be even steeper. So that means that we need to very rapidly reduce our emissions to come to a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. Okay, so now, second half, looking forward. So let's look at what the aims and objectives of COP26 are, where we're at with the NDCs, look at maybe the UK as it's the host of this conference, and then what to expect. Okay, so in terms of aims and objectives, now these are just mine, and this is not a formal list, but I would say kind of the broadest aim is really debating, discussing, working out how we can halve global emissions by 2030. And 2030 really is around the corner. And then beyond that, reaching net zero by 2050, if we want to stay within the 1.5 degree warming threshold. The latest IPCC report of earlier this year says that it is still possible, but it would require unprecedented action to be taken immediately. Second, we have received, so a number of countries have submitted their new, more ambitious NDCs, but by far not all. And therefore, the aim would be to bring as many NDCs in as possible to continuously remind countries to submit their NDCs, and for those NDCs to be as ambitious as possible in order to reduce this emission gap that I showed you on the slide before. So the gap is really the gap between business as usual. I'll go back. Let's see if I can go back again. So the difference. So the longer we wait, the higher the increase will become, and the bigger the gap between that and where we should be if we were to keep on a 2 degree or 1.5 degree threshold. So this gap is going to continue to increase as we do nothing or very little. So and then another objective perhaps would be around bringing countries into honor, reminding them to honor their 2009 promise to mobilize more finance, as it was promised in 2009 during the Copenhagen conference, of reaching up to $100 billion of funding per year. And this has still not been reached. And then finally, the objective is to finalize the Paris rule book, which should have happened a couple of years ago. And the big outstanding issues still remain the international carbon markets, that would be Article 6, making progress on loss and damage mechanism, and then also working out the global goal on adaptation that is in the Paris Agreement. So when we look at the NDCs, so far this is a recent update. So as of September this month, we have 86 countries in the EU that have submitted their updated NDCs to the UNFCCC. There are a few countries like China and Japan that have pledged 2030 targets but have not yet submitted them. So hopefully that will happen very soon. And then just to give you an example of a few countries of where they're at with their pledges, the UK has pledged to reduce emissions by 68% by 2030 and from 1990 levels, and 78% by 2035. So that could be considered quite ambitious. The EU, on the other hand, has pledged a reduction of 55% by 2030 from 1990 levels. The US has now submitted an NDC where it pledges a reduction of 50 to 52%, and it compares that to 2005 levels. And that's quite interesting. So if you look at a graph of emissions, 2005 is actually the peak. So that's when one of two peaks that are about the same, that's the earlier peak. So obviously that's much higher a baseline than 1990 levels would be. So it's easier, of course, to reduce from a higher baseline than it is from a lower. So you can't really compare 50% of the US with 55% of the EU if that's 1990 levels. And then there are a number of countries that include Australia, Brazil, Indonesia, Mexico, New Zealand, Russia, Singapore, Switzerland, and Vietnam that have not yet submitted, that have submitted NDCs, but have not raised ambition. So those would be similar to what they had submitted about 5 years ago. So taken together, these updates, these NDC updates, only reduce the emission gap to 1.5 degrees by 15% max. So that's really not much at all. So when we look at the UK, and a bit tongue-in-cheek, but the actions of recent weeks and months, I'm wondering whether they might speak louder than words. So firstly, the UK has recently approved its first new coal mine in 30 years. Of course, there was a lot of outlash against it. It is licensing for new North Sea oil and gas exploration. It is cutting on taxes on flights and supporting expansion plans at 7 airports in England. It is scrapping the Green Homes Grant energy efficiency scheme early. It is investing some £27 billion into new roads and highways. And at the same time reducing grants for electric car buyers. And then Boris Johnson recently at the last G7 meeting earlier in the summer, notoriously flew to Cornwall. And then as he arrived, he was touting that the UK was building back greener. So another kind of look at what's going on in terms of UK spinning on climate change, perhaps. Here's the slogan, coal, cash, cars, and trees. So this comes from a statement that Boris Johnson made following the last IPCC report release. And so he calls on countries to make big commitments in 4 particular areas. So first, coal. There he wants developed countries to kick the habit of coal completely by the end of this decade, and developing countries maybe by 2040. On cars, it says governments should abandon the use of internal combustion engines and transition to electric vehicles. In terms of cash, reminding countries to honor their 100 billion pledge on climate finance. And then on trees, to protect nature and end the massacre of the forests. But of course, as you might remember from my previous slide, some of this doesn't quite get implemented here in the UK. So I've got a few questions for the crystal ball, maybe to start. Maybe also some of you are able to have some insights on this, and maybe this will generate some discussion as well. So first question, of course, is will COP26 really happen as currently planned, with offering badges to some 28,000 people in Glasgow and allowing some 14,000 into the conference centre at any given point in time, given the current pandemic and restrictions? Second, have the UK and the world at large ever been serious about climate change? Will they now? Has something changed, or maybe worded slightly differently? What lies behind the ever-growing chasm between rhetoric and action? So I'll leave it here, and I look forward to an engaged discussion. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Heike. Really clear and concise outline of the procedures, the history, and where we're at now. Yeah, it's a really interesting time to be in the UK thinking about climate change for sure, and you've put some good questions in there. So there's been loads of great questions already in the chat panel, but folks, if you have more questions or more thoughts, please feel free to pile them in there, and I'll try and get through them all, but maybe Hannah, you can help me if I miss any that look really useful that I haven't merged together, and we'll try and get to them. So I'll go down mostly in order. One of the questions from Schroeder, Heike, was how do the NDCs feed into IPCC projections? Because I know you showed that graph of the emissions gap, but of course that changes all the time based on these different promises as to what will happen in the future. And the latest graphs in my mind from the IPCC show more or less kind of a flat line if we follow the current policies up to between 2.5 and 4 degrees C by the end of the century. And of course, that's a long way off still from the 1.5 degree goal. But how do the promises that countries make feed into those projections? Do you know?
Great, thanks. Great question. So there is the IPCC, and then there is the UNEP emissions graph. So the graph that I showed actually was created initially by UNEP to understand what the emissions gap was. The projections of the IPCC and the scenarios are slightly different, but of course, a lot of different organizations are now trying to make sense of what is being pledged and whether or not that holds, in terms of, or how that then translates into how far off we are from 1.5 or 2 degrees warming. And a lot of countries have margins so that they will say from X to Y. And some of the countries actually have relative goals, so intensity targets, for example. So and then it really depends on economic growth, for example, indicators, for example, how much it is in real terms at the end. So therefore, you usually see these margins from 2. The graph I showed is quite simplistic, actually, and it was the first one that wasn't, horribly out of date, because most of these graphs are still from, 2015, and then now we're in 2025. So I was looking for something a little bit more updated, and then decided to just go with this more abstract one. So the last kind of the figure I mentioned was just the difference between the last round of NDCs and this round is very minimal on the whole still. Whereas the idea was always that we would start off being aware of where we needed to be, and then try and make it happen so that technology breakthroughs, changes in pricing, etc., would be able to help us accelerate toward the goal that we have set ourselves. So there was a lot of banking, as it were, on an acceleration of reduction trajectories. So the kind of initial hump would be the hardest. So we would take it easy on the first round of, NDCs. As long as we get started, it's okay. But this round actually is very disappointing, to be honest. There's not a lot of increase at all. And then what's really quite, questionable is the countries, and here I will just point to the UK, and I do believe that pressure is important, that they have now submitted a fairly ambitious NDC and set of reduction targets, but the rhetoric does not show, any taking this seriously at all. So my question is really very seriously, will this be implemented, and how is there really a serious plan in place or not? The IPCC is much more kind of scientific in that it really looks at what's needed from a scenarios from a modeling perspective. whereas the NDCs are what countries are willing to do or to promise for now. Thanks for that question.
Yeah, thanks, Heike. Yeah, and it's really important to call that out, of course, that these are just promises, and the reality on the ground very much doesn't match those promises, even if the promises are insufficient in themselves. So yeah, very interesting. There are lots of questions in here. I'm going to see if we can kind of combine some. There's a quick one here from Sylvia, which is, who is participating in the negotiations of the Paris rulebook? And I think the answer is everyone who participates in the conferences, right? There are delegations from every country. And in fact, that's one of the interesting things about this process, is that every country gets a voice in a sense, although some of them might bully others into certain positions. But rather than the World Bank or the IMF, where the amount of money your country makes determines how much of a voice you get, this is trying to be a level playing field. Is that right?
Yeah, so in theory, abstractly, absolutely, one country, one vote. Any country could, in theory, veto any agreement, any outcome, any decision. But in practice, because it's such an increasingly dense kind of timetable and agenda of multiple in parallel meetings, where only the big delegations can actually even have a chance at covering everything and having a good oversight. Many of the smaller countries, especially the poor countries that can afford only to send, let's say, 2 to 5 delegates, they can only cover so much amongst them. So that's an issue of inequity right there. So what has happened has been that countries have banded together in alliances. There are the more established ones. Obviously, the most established one and the most cohesive perhaps is the EU. But there are then alliances across other developed countries called the Umbrella Group. That includes all of the others, mainly the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Norway sometimes, Switzerland sometimes. And then there are, of course, the G77, but they are a very large group, and they often speak on behalf of the G77 if they have a very clear common position. But more often than not, there are subgroups within that. So then there's the African group, AOSIS, the OPEC country, and obviously they have very different agendas themselves. So they will coordinate as much as possible and help, but really then will be limited to specific topics, to specific agenda items where they have common ground. So that is then the negotiation in practice, that there's a lot of work within these groups, these alliances, and then they speak with one voice in the larger meetings like the COPs. But then there are also the subsidiary bodies of SBI, Substa. So I don't want to throw too many acronyms at you, but that's where the work happens in the COPs. And that's where all the countries will sit. And the majority of them these days speak on behalf of their group.
Thanks, Heike. That's really helpful. There's lots of questions on this $100 billion financing for developing countries to, my understanding is it's to deal with the effects of climate change. Really, it's a very small amount in the grand scheme of things, as a kind of from the rich countries to the poor. Yes, we've made a mess of this, and here's some money to clean it up where you are. Which, I mean, that's probably a very crass analysis, but that's my understanding. Maybe we can talk a bit more about that. I'll just quickly share an amusing story. I was in a talk about COP last week with one of the advisors, who was an advisor to Gordon Brown's government in 2009 for the Copenhagen summit. And there was this conversation about how much this money should be. And the developing countries were saying, well, it needs to be 200 billion, 400 billion, 500 billion. And the US and Japan were saying, no, we'd say about 30 billion or 40 billion. And apparently Gordon Brown and his team just wrote down 100 billion on an envelope and brought it to this room and said, let's meet in the middle and go for this. And people seemed to get on board with it, more or less, which just shows you how much stuff can be pulled out of thin air, and it's not necessarily evidenced as the right number. But John's question was, what roughly is that 100 billion for? Is it, and I kind of made a go at it earlier, but what is your understanding of the purpose of that 100 billion? What's it for?
Right, so it started out as a promise that Hillary Clinton brought as the foreign secretary at the time to Copenhagen. And it was a bit like everybody was expecting some kind of present. So from the US, there was some kind of expectation of something. And then she said this, and at first almost seemed like the US was so generous, but then actually the wording got changed to it's being all developed countries would together move toward 100 billion a year, I think from 2020 onwards, whereas, you know, in 2050, at first it was less. I think it might have been 20 billion. I can't, sorry, I'm not 100% certain that that's correct, but I think so. So anyway, it was always vague. And it was clear, though, that a lot of money was needed to adapt to climate change in developing countries that were already seeing increased extreme weather events, needed to upgrade infrastructure and architecture. So there was a lot that was needed in all countries. There was, of course, also money that was needed to help mitigate climate change. So there is a bigger need than adaptation already. And previously, there were the NAMAs and the NAPAs, so ways in which developed countries would help developing countries through projects to mitigate and adapt to climate change. So a lot of it was already there. And it was always known that it was not enough. It was never, you know, even scratching the surface of what really was needed to do a good job. And so that's how then the kind of more concrete figure became quite an interesting new kind of starting point for really thinking through the needs for an international climate finance mechanism and architecture to enable the transfer of funds from developed to developing countries in a more maybe bureaucratic way. The architecture, and this is something I've never really done much work on, so I'm not really actually quite sure where we're at. But there's a lot of literature for sure to look that up if you are interested. But the architecture is still being developed. There's still a lot of detail that needs to be worked out in terms of how to effectively set up such a mechanism of transfer. And then there's, of course, loss and damage, which is a whole debate on its own in terms of the idea that we're not actually talking about donations, you know, generous donations from developed to developing countries, but we're talking about the fact that the actions of the global north through industrialization has produced loss and damage in other countries. So they have a legal, you know, a legal right to claim money for the loss and damage experienced as a result. But the negotiations are very convoluted on that, very political, and they have not yet been concluded.
Yeah, thanks, Heike. And there are a few people asking kind of, well, although we're not at that 100 billion now, where are we and how is it working? Again, I don't know loads about this, but I get the sense that with the US's latest promise that was a week or so ago, it's up to around 75 billion, but very much the majority of that is what used to be aid finance for other development projects is now being kind of shifted towards kind of green aid in a sense, or climate aid. And as always, much of that has also been in the form of loans, which depending on the way you look at it, can be seen as kind of actually an extraction of wealth from those countries rather than actual deposition or a paying back of a debt. So it's very interesting. Let's see. One of the themes in the questions has been about the binding nature of any commitments, and whether there was a question here from, let me see if I can find it, from Shalini. Yes, this is, so given the rate at which greenhouse gas emissions are increasing and the targets are still far away from reality, is there any mechanism for which there's a credit or reward for countries who achieve the targets or are on the right path, or penalties for those who don't? And I suppose it kind of gets into the way the whole negotiations worked, which was like they're voluntary. And so that's the only way we could find this agreement in a sense. But are there any mechanisms for saying to Australia, for example, or whoever, or countries who aren't doing their bit in a sense, to pull them in that sense?
Yeah, good question.
I also think it would be valuable just to reiterate how the NDCs are binding, but then actually fulfilling the NDCs or not. It seems like there was some confusion about that in the chat. So.
Okay, yeah. So the mechanism is called naming, shaming, and blaming. And there are a lot of organizations that are putting out, like Action Tracker, putting out lists showing whether countries are in the green zone of actually being ambitious versus in the kind of yellow zone of being kind of blurry somewhere in between, and in the red zone as in blatantly insufficient. So a lot of organizations are trying to make sense and publicizing this information. There's always been these kinds of mechanisms of naming, blaming, and shaming also at the conferences. And so just, watchdogs producing a bit of bad breath for countries, but it doesn't seem that countries really take that much note, because they don't necessarily change their politics and their policies. So on the question of the NDCs, so it is a requirement for every country that ratifies the Paris Agreement to submit an NDC, but there is no requirement as to what it actually includes in terms of content. So a country could, in theory, produce submit a blank paper as their NDC. So they would have met the requirements of submitting something. That's it in terms of from a legal point of view. But it's even hard. I mean, you can mandate as much as you like. Countries will still perhaps not follow suit. And so already now we don't have, we have a few good NDCs submitted, but not many at all. And the idea is also that every subsequent NDC would be more ambitious than the previous one. But also that is not being followed in this round.
Thanks, Heike. There's a good short question here, which I realize I don't even know the answer to that much, but Jay was asking out of curiosity, who are the people who actually sit in these negotiations? Are they politicians or scientists with some authority or something else?
Great, yeah, good question. Back in 2012, I actually did a study looking at who sits on delegations. And so maybe we can make that paper available to you all if you want to have a look. But basically, there is a lot of difference across countries. Some countries mainly have a few select ministry representatives on their delegations, and they would traditionally be mainly Foreign Office, Environment Ministry, maybe finance, maybe economy, industry, that kind of range. Some countries, interestingly, I think China used to have a lot of scientists on their delegation, a lot of science agency representatives. Other countries, like I think maybe Scandinavian countries, have for a longer period of time already had civil society representatives on the delegations as well, youth representatives. Very few countries have indigenous peoples representatives on their delegations, although of course indigenous people are minorities in many countries around the world. So the practice really varies. And also, as I said before, some country delegations only have a handful of people on them, and others have hundreds. And also it's possible that you can have a foreigner on your delegation. So there are many examples of where, especially AOSIS countries, small island states, and maybe African countries have invited international legal experts or academics onto their delegation. And then these people would help them to make sense and to strategize, and just, be an NGO kind of arm, and also have good links to the international experts on all sorts of topics. So we have that possibility as well. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Heike. There's been a couple of questions here, and maybe we'll turn it into a bit of a meta question, and no worries if there's not an easy answer, but there have been various kind of corporate and company commitments on climate over the past year or so, and there's lots of focus on where companies fit into this puzzle. And of course, what's being negotiated at these conferences is very much like a country level and a policy level. How do all of those things fit together? Is there any sense whereby what companies are doing can actually influence the speed at which policymakers are pushing down this path, or is it usually the other way around, in that companies are sort of falling in line with whatever the policies are agreed? Any kind of thoughts on that?
That's a really good question. So the UNFCCC does not allow companies per se to participate. So everybody who is at the UNFCCC has to be a member of a non-profit and arm. So what you can get is members of representing companies through, the Sustainable Business Council, for example, on climate change, or some kind of philanthropic arms of companies, and so that they are themselves not involved in the business side of things. They will represent then the positions and interests. So companies have never actually really had a big presence at the COPs. But that said, obviously, they would have for sure had a big presence in the offices of the civil servants who would be preparing positions for countries. And so they have other ways of lobbying their countries in very effective ways. So they don't need to necessarily be seen at the COPs. So that already is a curious phenomenon, that the biggest shapers of country policy, shall we say, in many parts of the world, don't have to actually be present at the actual negotiations. I think it's though very important in terms of signaling what comes from the business sector, and it depends really on which business sector you look at. So insurance, for example, has actually, that voice has been present for a much longer time at the conferences, and because of course insurance industry has a big stake in understanding the future. So they need to know what to expect in terms of, strategize to devising their premiums, moving into the future and things like that. And of course, the fossil fuel industry will be, paying good attention to what is going on so that they know what they can and cannot do moving forward, etc. But at the same time, companies also realize that there is a growing market of consumers, who are wanting to buy greener, who are wanting to support companies only if they have a fairly good, ethical and green standing. So there are definitely a lot of interesting examples of pledges that have come from big multinationals. So, for example, Walmart has done a lot. They've had actually quite a big sustainability office, and they have definitely decarbonized their production processes in important ways. So I would say there has been some good change, but of course, some of it at least would have been a little bit greenwashed, where it might sound a lot better than it really is. And it is, of course, a signal that there is a raising, consumer awareness about what the companies do or don't do on issues that are of relevance to consumers. And then I think another sector, a business sector, agriculture, has really come into the center of attention. And that's a fairly recent event. I think it's been maybe the last 5 or so years that negotiators have talked more about agriculture as a driver of deforestation, and thereby also driver of climate change. And there's, of course, a really big shift now toward veganism. So that's an interesting link right there in terms of what the industry does.
Absolutely. Thanks, Heike. I've got one more kind of meta question in a sense, or a combined question, and then we'll try and start wrapping it up. And I've seen a really good closing question from John as well, which we'll come to towards the end. So let me just find it again. So Catherine was asking about the carbon markets question, and I noticed you mentioned that this kind of ambition to have an international or global carbon tax or carbon market. And again, for the fellows on our course, we'll dig into lots of this stuff later. I think in weeks 8, 9, and 10, there's all sorts of stuff on carbon markets and climate finance. But are we expecting any kind of agreement on an international price on carbon? Is there any conversations about like new currency in the form of carbon coins, which is kind of a hot topic at the moment? Do you sense any of that in these negotiations?
Right. Yeah, good. Thanks. Good question. So what I refer to as Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, the backdrop to that really is about how to bring the Kyoto markets, like the 3 Kyoto mechanism, emissions trading, CDM, and joint implementation, perhaps, that are markets that have been developed, how to bring that into the Paris Agreement so that that element of the Kyoto process is not lost. So is there a way of making those credits transferable, and how to make sense of them, and how to also just make the whole maybe carbon market more robust? So that's kind of ongoing debate. And then there's more going on, of course, beyond that in terms of carbon offsetting, pricing, carbon pricing. A lot of the experimentation with emissions trading has been quite regional, and so there's differences in experience and learning that has come out of it. I would say, on the whole, and again, this is not an area that I've worked on specifically, but on the whole, I think the sense is that there's a bit of a disappointment, maybe. I think there were more people that expected more to come off these carbon markets in previous years than now, because the carbon price has just not developed. It's been just way too low to really provide an incentive to the market.
Yeah. Thanks very much. So folks, we've got just about 5 minutes left. I want to just pause and see if anyone feels like they've put in an excellent question that I've skimmed over and haven't seen. Please call my attention to it now, and Hannah as well, hopefully is helping me. And if there's something, there's a few in there that I have seen, but they feel a little bit off topic. So I'll leave them, and we'll no doubt come back to them throughout the course. Let's see. Actually, I missed this one from Namita, which is quite interesting. How much do you think COVID has affected countries' commitment to climate change? So I'm sure it's hard to tease out different drivers on the trajectory that we're following now, but is there a sense where that has or hasn't had been a big impact?
Yeah, that's maybe a little bit also one for the crystal ball, but I would say it depends a little bit. Obviously, I would say obviously that COVID has received such a fairly quick and quite homogeneous on the whole response. Climate change is nowhere near that. It's quite eye-opening, I would say, how certain agendas get a lot of attention and others don't. It's been interesting to watch kind of carbon emission trajectories develop. So there was certainly a quite significant drop in transport-related emissions after, once the lockdown started in kind of last year. But at the same time, actually, there was an increase in illegal, especially deforestation in many countries. There's been an increase in other sectors as well, maybe housing, because everybody works from home now and has their heating on individually. And then as soon as restrictions drop, all the emissions go back up, and there's maybe even a sense of having to catch up on, what we didn't consume as we were in lockdown. So there's an interesting dynamic for sure. I think there is an increase in rhetoric for now on climate change for sure. But I have to say, I've been in the business too long to be too optimistic, shall I say. But also, I think at the end of the day, the reality is such that we have so many pressing problems in the world and limited resources that the best way forward really would be one of coordinating and harmonizing across, so that we actually address not just one single issue and whilst producing more harm for other issues, but that we're much more kind of tailored in trying to address as many problems at the same time, and effectively using our resources. Something, again, that I don't think there is a lot of good track record on. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. So we're coming up to the end of the hour now. So just want to thank you again, Heike, for the session, and thanks very much everyone for being here and these excellent questions. I'm going to end with a question from John, which is, what do you think is the one thing that we as citizens can do to add pressure to our country's representatives to make or uphold these more aggressive commitments?
Nice. That's a really good question. I would say, again, it depends on where you are, what the biggest driver of emissions is. I think here in the UK, you could go, with the list that I showed you of things that were going counter to promises on climate change in terms of new infrastructure development. Do we really need expansions of airports? Of course, different people would argue in different ways. And so you can take a lot of different positions also personally in terms of what you think that is most valuable. Do you think it's more valuable to put your energy into stopping, infrastructure that is ungreen versus working on building, creating maybe more small-scale farming, local agriculture versus industrial, large-scale farming? There's a lot of different things that every individual can do. And I would say, actually, from an individual perspective, it really is that vote that we make on a daily basis in terms of as to what we buy. Where do we put our money? Who do we give our money to? What do we support? What do we not support? Do we support, companies that do something about problems that we're faced with versus not? Do they also hold? And again, this is not necessarily, it doesn't have to be just linear and just squarely about climate change, but it's the whole etiquette, the whole kind of rhetoric, the whole kind of, setup of a country. Are they paying their workers? Are they offering good social standards? Are they doing something for their communities? To build that kind of vibrant community of maybe enterprises that all have a stake in the world, in the future of our, for ourselves and future generations. So I think that's really important, to really just be conscious consumers and maybe buy, clothing from sustainable outlets that actually do organic cotton versus conventional cotton or alternative materials. Think about what you eat. is the food high or low in carbon? Fruit and vegetables on the whole are very low in carbon. Meat is very high. Dairy is very high. Processed foods on the whole is very high, etc., etc. So it's really about making conscious choices on a daily basis. And that really adds up, I think. So that's much more about what you can do. But in terms of what we can ask our representatives to do, I would say it really depends on what the cutting edge, the stake is in your own country, where the emissions are increasing.
Thanks, Heike. And it's reminded me that I think if anyone is in easy traveling distance of Glasgow and interested in going and sort of showing your passion for real climate action, I believe the main kind of demonstrations outside the conference center will be on the first weekend of November, which is the middle weekend of the 2-week conference. I'm hoping to go myself. It's a few hours ride on the train, and hopefully I'll find somewhere to stay. And that's one way of making our voices heard, of course. So that just leaves me to say thank you so much again to Heike. Thanks everyone for being here. The recording will be available online afterwards, and yeah, just thanks again, and have a good rest of your day wherever you are.
Great, thank you, Liam, and thanks everyone for really fantastic questions. And I wish you a very enjoyable course.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.